Welcome, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Earline, and I'm Senior Director of Research and Programs at the National Health Council. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on sources of real-world data and introduction to patient registries. And this is a webinar that is put together by the National Health Council in partnership with the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. Next slide, please. In case you're not familiar with the National Health Council, we're made up of more than 140 diverse organizations that come together to forge consensus and drive patient-centered health policy. The majority of our members are voluntary health agencies or patient advocacy organizations, and their logos are listed here. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with the webinar. The webinar is going to be recorded and it will be archived on our website afterwards. So you're welcome to take a look at it, share it later on. It's next to all of our other webinars in this series, so you can visit all of them. Please make sure that you're on mute throughout the presentation, and feel free to submit any questions through the chat function. We have presentations for about half an hour, and then we'll have around 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So feel free to submit questions through the chat. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I also wanted to acknowledge the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute for supporting this training and introduction to real-world evidence and real-world data. This program is going to be a virtual program that includes webinars such as this webinar, as well as a number of resources that we're actively developing, along with our advisory board members. So a big thank you to everybody on this list for helping us put together the series and the resources. Next slide, please. Without further ado, we can move right into the session. Can go to the next slide. And a reminder that the next webinar in this series will be taking place on December the 11th. The most recent one that we had was on also introduction to real world data, and that was on an intro to big data such as administrative claims and online data, form data. This presentation will, of course, be introducing patient registries. And then as our next topic, which will be held in conjunction also with our partner ISPOR, we'll be delving into data privacy issues, which have come up a lot in the Q&A and our previous webinars. So feel free to register for that one. Can go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce our guest speakers today. I'm very honored to be joined by two of our advisory board members today who will be presenting. We have Vanessa Boulanger, who's the Director of Research at the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Vanessa oversees the management, growth, and implementation of NORD's research and scientific activities. And in 2018, she was appointed as a member of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute's advisory panel on rare diseases. And then we also are joined by Dr. Robert McBurney. Robert is the Chief Research Officer and former CEO of the Accelerated Cure Project for Multiple Sclerosis, which is a nonprofit organization accelerating multiple sclerosis research to improve the health, healthcare, and quality of life of people affected by multiple sclerosis. And he's also the co-principal investigator of the iConquerMS People-Powered Research Network. So we're very, very excited to have both Vanessa and Robert joining us today. They're experts on patient registries and will be able to provide an introduction to patient registries generally, but then also provide some case examples of the work that they're each doing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to our partners at the National Health Council and Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy for the opportunity to participate in this important and really timely webinar series. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Vanessa Boulanger, and I direct the research and scientific work at the National Organization for Rare Disorders, or NORD. And for those who are tuning in today who may be a little bit less familiar with NORD, for nearly 4 decades, we've led the way in voicing the needs of the rare disease community through advancing research, through supportive policies and education, and through community engagement, providing patient and family services for those who need them most. NORD began as a small group of patient advocates that formed a coalition to unify and mobilize really grassroots support to pass the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, and then shortly thereafter formalized as an independent advocacy organization that works each day on behalf of and in support of families and patients affected by rare diseases. So I'm sharing this history and background just because it will help frame some of the content that I'll be presenting today. Next slide. So first, we'll discuss some of the specific challenges for rare disease research, and then look at tools for real-world data collection. And then we'll talk about the importance of community-driven research initiatives. And then I will share a case example of how to kind of put all of this together in action and practice. Next slide. So at its highest level, research is really a way to tell a story, to share experiences, to identify patterns that lead to discovery. And in this process, every individual, every experience when doing human subject research is so critically important and valuable to unlocking the next advancement for their condition. And for rare diseases, this is even more so the case. With small patient populations and rare conditions, it's each story and each experience is really critical to moving the needle forward for each rare condition. Next slide. So since I work in the rare disease community at NORD, I'll just focus in on a few of the specific challenges and then how patient registries and natural history studies are tools that can help to create solutions. So there are over 7,000 known rare diseases with new rare conditions being discovered each year, with estimates around 250 new diseases being discovered each year. There are approximately 90 or more than 90% of rare diseases do not yet have an FDA-approved treatment or therapy, and many rare conditions are not even being studied yet, meaning that there's very little known about the condition and that there's limited foundational knowledge, if any, that exists in the literature. Next slide. So to expand a little bit further on some of the challenges, you'll see here on this slide that funding for rare diseases is often quite limited, which can impact scientific discovery and timelines for research. How nimble and quickly researchers are able to move in rare disease research. There's often limited understanding of the progression of a disease, so we're really sort of building research, the foundational research for these conditions as we're trying to learn about them and do drug discovery work. And not only is there limited information about identifying the identification of conditions, but also in how these conditions evolve or progress over time and across different subsections of the population as well. Rare disease, populations by nature, they're often quite small. So there are few patients, often geographically dispersed, and so identifying people who are within the community and then engaging them in research is an important step and often can be a bit of a challenge as you're getting started. And then standardization of measures, so data elements that are common across studies so that the data can be harmonized and compared and analyzed across studies or across diseases is a challenge across many different areas of scientific study, but in particular for rare diseases as well, where there are very few validated tool sets or measure sets for a lot of these rare conditions. So there's a lot of de novo research happening across these different rare communities. And then data ownership and sharing. The community itself, I think, is taking a big step in the direction of really breaking through some of the data silos that exist and looking at how to best share data so that we're kind of reducing burden on patients and participants so that they're not being asked to participate in study after study after study, but that we're really able to combine data and leverage data that does already exist for rare diseases and use it for broader use cases and multiple purposes. Next slide. So this is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the AHRQ definition of a patient registry. So I'll just read the definition. They define a patient registry as an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data, clinical and other, to evaluate specified outcomes for a population defined by a particular disease, condition, or exposure, and that serves one or more stated scientific, clinical, or policy purposes. So patient registries are data collection tools that can support the collection of patient-reported data, clinician-reported data, and the data collected is often on, diagnostic status or diagnostic journey, disease progression, standards of care, clinical effectiveness, safety, and/or quality of care. And then you can really think about how these studies are defined and designed to look at, the collection of those specific data elements, but also by different views of the population. So registries can be focused on a certain geographic area or a certain health condition or diagnostic, certain diagnostic criteria. They can be focused on different age groups or by different, symptoms or medical procedures, for example. And then optimally designed studies are really thoughtfully planned out to make sure that the data can be used for the goal and purpose in mind, with the flexibility to expand the use of the data for additional and varied purposes. And then by doing this, we're really, taking important steps towards reducing participant burden, so people have less of a need to participate in multiple and sometimes repetitive studies. And we're really, using the data for the full life that it has to inform as many use cases and purposes as it can. So patient registries are also quite valuable tools, particularly in this moment in time during the COVID pandemic, in that they can support remote participation in research and telehealth activities in an accessible way that does not require in-person participation. It's all virtual participation and, often a way that folks can participate from their home and continue to push research forward without having to go to a physical site. Next slide. So then as we think about how we're defining real-world data collection, there are lots of ways to kind of think about how we're defining our approach to these studies. So how you think about establishing a patient registry, and then how you're designing and defining the real-world data that will get collected in that patient registry is a really critical first step. So, patient registries can be used to identify and centralize individuals with a particular condition. They can be used to collect data that describes disease progression and the natural course or natural history of a disease. They can be used to collect patient experience or patient preference data. So really understanding risk-benefit or trade-offs that a patient population might be willing to make. They can be used as surveillance tools. So like epidemiological surveillance tools for a disease outbreak, for example, or they can be used to measure and monitor safety of a product or a therapy, and also quality of care or standards of care. And then the data coming out of registries as well can also be used to assess clinical or cost effectiveness of different treatments. So really, sort of honing in on how you're designing and defining the real world data that does get collected in your study, and your purpose for doing so is a very critical first step to optimizing your study design. Defining the community that you're trying to reach and engage with will help to inform who you need to engage at what point, and will help with recruitment as the study evolves. And then, thinking through what committee support you might need to help support the design and then the implementation of your study. So do you need a scientific and medical advisory committee? Do you need a committee of experts or a data ontology committee to review the data elements that you'll be collecting in this study. Do you have connection with an IRB partner? These are all really important considerations to think about in advance as you're planning, so that the vision, the goal, and the objectives and the metrics are outlined and defined prior to launching a study. Next slide. And then to reach a diverse and representative population, and to have authentic and engagement with the community and partnership from the beginning, it really helps to establish trust and close connection with the community early on. So, having community members be research partners with you as you are designing a study, or ideally owning the development of a study with support from, academic partners or other stakeholders. These studies can be assets to patient communities, and then the more that folks from the actual community or the target population are involved in the design of the studies, the more likely you are to have outcomes that are actually meaningful to patient communities. So this patient-driven data collection is really key and can reshape a lot of what we know about how people experience different conditions, and what is truly meaningful to the patient community, what would actually move the needle forward for them. Next slide. So I just wanted to share a brief case study example of a study that NORD is leading. Okay, I just wanted to share a brief case study example of a study that NORD is leading with funding and partnership from the FDA. So we are looking at designing a natural history study for the metachromatic leukodystrophy. And the idea with this study is sort of threefold. One is to design a natural history study that captures very specific and nuanced data on the metachromatic leukodystrophy community, and then to have this enduring data set or database that can be used to support product development. So that can be used as a supplement to clinical trials and be used to serve as an external control arm in clinical trials. And the idea here really is to capture a very specified set of information at a very specified frequency or schedule of data collection, and then to have this enduring resource and this data set that can be used by multiple stakeholders to reduce the recruitment burden as they're designing clinical trials. And so by accessing this data set that has been rigorously designed by the patient community advisory committee that we have, by the clinician and industry advisory committee that we have, by NORD, and by the FDA or statistician group, the idea is that this study will, is sort of pre-approved to meet regulatory requirements. And then the application of the study is that folks who have enrolled will participate for a 12-month period, and then the data will sort of live on and be accessible to stakeholders as needed. And it will reduce the need to recruit for control arms in trials, or even just to have a comparator arm as clinical trials do progress. So it's sort of a novel use case for a patient registry or a natural history study. And we really were very thoughtful in how we designed the study to ensure that the burden on patients as they're participating, or patients and families, caregivers as they're participating, was as reasonable as it could be. So the whole study is virtual. We have a virtual study visit schedule set up with a clinical study coordinator, and then we have the ability to collect do mobile data collection through a mobile app that will do EHR integration as well. So I share this just as a way to say, patient registries can kind of range from very basic sort of contact registries where you're just centralizing the community and finding patients and bringing them together, all the way up through pretty advanced use cases where you're really considering and evaluating every single data element that goes into a study, and then defining a pretty specific use case for the data outputs as well. Next slide. And then very briefly, I just wanted to share a few resources. So on NORD's website, we have a few resources around, what is a patient registry and why do they help the rare disease community? So this is a video that we have on our site that I would encourage you to take a look at. And then we also have our own platform that can support a variety of different models. So, we have our iConquerMS registry platform that is flexible and can support, a variety of different study models, anything from sort of a basic registry study all the way up through the case example that I just shared with you. So we're always happy on the research team in order to, continue that conversation and consult with you if you have questions around, how to take the next step for your study or your community. Next slide. And then these are just some additional resources that I find to be really useful. So the AHRQ guide on registries is a very long document, but it's a very, very comprehensive document on all of the considerations, or a lot of the considerations, for establishing patient registries. The FDA has put out some really great draft guidances on the use of natural history studies for drug development, and also around patient-focused drug development. And then the NIH has a great toolkit on their radar site. So I would encourage you to take a look there as well if you're interested in designing your own work. And next slide. And then I just want to say thank you to the research team at NORD, the team that I work with, and please do reach out if you have questions or would like to connect with me after this chat. I'm happy to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. And now to Robert.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks to the National Health Council and its staff for making this series possible with PCORI funding. I'd like to focus on primarily one registry, the iConquerMS People-Powered Research Network, which I have the privilege to co-lead as the research lead, along with a person living with MS who resides in Ohio, Laura Koloskowski. Next slide, please. So just to reinforce what the difference is between registries and clinical trials. A clinical trial is a very defined population for a particular study. And because of inclusion-exclusion criteria, real people living with certain diseases are often not included in the clinical trial population because they have some, they don't meet either the inclusion, but often the exclusion. They are excluded because of the exclusion criteria. Registries are a heterogeneous population of all comers with, generally speaking, no limits on any of the characteristics of the registry participants. A clinical trial population has a set number of participants, and a registry can be just growing over time, making it possible to reveal many outcomes, both efficacy outcomes and safety outcomes, that can only be seen with very much larger numbers. So people like me are in the registry, but maybe I'm not. A person like me is not included in a clinical trial population. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes or less, so we've got time for questions, is something about the wide range of registries. And then I'm going to focus on the single registry iConquerMS, which is a people-powered research network, talking about what iConquerMS does, at least in overview, and a little bit about our response to COVID-19, but because I think that's a good example of what can happen when you have lots of registries around the globe. Next slide, please. So registries can have different flavors from what I would refer to as the traditional clinic-based registry that primarily has data from the electronic medical record anonymized in the registry, but essentially has no patient engagement. And then the other end is the people-powered research networks, which predominantly are patient-provided data, again, anonymized when it's used. And the key feature with the people-powered research network is that it has substantial patient engagement. And of course, everything in between those two examples, and occasionally a registry that has everything. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about the iConquerMS People-Powered Research Network, which was established in 2014 with funding from PCORI, along with a number of other, almost 20 people-powered research networks across a wide range of common and rare diseases. The iConquerMS network has approximately 7,000 registered participants today, and it grows every day by small and sometimes larger numbers, depending upon what the network is doing. The key aspects of the iConquerMS network, it is participant powered. So every aspect of it is driven by the insights and data from people affected by multiple sclerosis. It's participant governed. Every part of its governance, whether it's the governing board or the research committee, is comprised of, or the majority of that entity is people affected by MS. It's very participant centered. So examples are that it's very focused on patient-reported outcomes and also on what Vanessa just mentioned about the patient-focused drug development, and I'll give an example of that. And it is inclusive, so all people affected by MS, including care partners and including a focus on diversity. Next slide, please. So what does iConquerMS do? Well, a lot of things and too much to document in this, but just giving the areas that we're involved in. So governance is a very important activity of the network. So there's as I mentioned, there's a governing board, there's a research committee similar to something that Vanessa mentioned before. There's also an engagement committee. There's something we refer to as the data squad. And also a minority engagement task force, because one of the things that's found fairly universally across registries is the representation of underrepresented minorities is not up to the true representation in the prevalence of the particular disease. And so we have a focus in that area as well. There are a number of other things that the network does. You'll see there Real MS, which stands for Research Engagement About Life with MS, which is our major data collection activity. But in addition to collecting data in a regular and uniform way, we also work with academics or with out of our own initiation to generate specific ad hoc questionnaires on particular topics, and the network members respond to that. In addition to that, and something I'll mention a little bit later, which is for our future, we collect suggestions of topics for research from the community members. And we also contribute ideas and the network assets and data to a wide range of research studies. Probably in the last few years, we've contributed to more than 20 research studies that otherwise might have had a hard time of moving forward. So the registry is not your grandmother's registry, which is mostly about data, but it's about people plus data and how that can really move research forward. And of course, that's one of the histories of the rare disease area as well. And MS is not a rare disease. In the United States, there are about 1 million people with multiple sclerosis. But it's a very heterogeneous disease, and some people actually think it's a collection of rare diseases, like a spectrum disorder. It was less than 30 years ago that MS had its first disease-modifying therapy introduced, and remarkably, there are about 20 different disease-modifying therapies available today. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to talk about data and then talk about people and talk about some of the things that we've been doing specifically in COVID-19, and then talk a little bit about the future. We collect a lot of data from the participants, maybe overburdening them with data collection twice a year. Of course, that's just a single point in time for a disease that has a fluctuating nature. And so we'd love to collect data more frequently, and we're actually looking into devices at the moment to make that possible. We collect demographics, the characteristics of people's multiple sclerosis, which, as I said, vary quite widely. We collect a comprehensive quality of life form, which started with the NeuroQual adult short form, which was developed for a wide range of neurological disorders. And we've added things. And you'll note here that not everything was started at the same time. And so the network's data collection has been responsive to the interests of the community. We started collecting physical activity, whether you're exercising, etc. In 2016, towards the end of 2016. And we also started collecting comorbid conditions. And then most recently, a great deal of interest in the impact of wellness and diet on the course of multiple sclerosis. So we're collecting data, and that data collection is very responsive to the needs of the community. I'd like to talk about the NeuroQual adult short form data in the next slide. And this perhaps, could I have the next slide, please? And this perhaps highlights the value of a registry. So when you take a questionnaire about symptoms, abilities, and quality of life, which is what the NeuroQual adult short form is about, it contains 13 different domains, each with 8 questions around about per domain. You can generate an average score, because the answers are something like sometimes, often, always on a 5-point scale. And you can create a score from that, those responses. And interestingly, this is what the scores were for 1,400 people in our network quite a few years ago, but things haven't changed in terms of the importance or what affects people with MS the most. Fatigue comes to the top, in other words, the worst symptom for people with MS. And then there are a variety of things that include sleep disturbance, anxiety, cognitive function, and lower extremity functional mobility. Now, the interesting thing, if you would click on the slide, is that mobility is one of the standard clinical trial outcome measures. It's something called the Expanded Disability Status Scale, which only focuses really on mobility, despite its name. To date, if you click again, the other symptoms and quality of life domains that affect people with MS have rarely been available in MS clinical trial results and regulatory submissions. So actually, we don't know, except for subsequent studies and small studies, what the effect is of some of the drugs on some of the symptoms that affect people with MS the most. So that's one of the things you can do with a registry that's collecting more than just clinical data that might appear in an electronic health record. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk about people, and particularly people and patient-focused drug development. So back in 2018, while the FDA was still releasing guidances and seeking feedback, we were approached, our network was approached by EMD Serono, who were wanting to practice patient-focused drug development at an early stage. And we began a collaboration with them back in 2018, in which we had a joint patient-focused drug development project team, but most importantly, a patient-focused drug development council of 8 diverse people with MS. Now, this might have looked a little bit like the traditional patient advisory board that many pharma companies put together when they're doing clinical trials or for other purposes. But actually, this was quite different, because this council of people were established and met multiple times, every month or even more frequently, over a 1-year period from the start of the collaboration to the launch of the phase 3 clinical trial. And the council was involved in many different aspects of the clinical trial design and implementation, all the way from deciding on what patient-reported outcomes should be included in the clinical trial outcome measures, all the way through to how the trial outcome should be described in prescribing information once the drug is approved. And so I think this is one of the great things that a registry that involves both people and data can really contribute. And I can tell you that the council members were very excited to be included in this way. Next slide, please. Just briefly talking about the response to COVID-19. So in March of this year, a call went out globally for all of the patient registries that wanted to join to come together in an initiative focused on the effect of COVID-19 on people living with MS, because this is an autoimmune disease where people are, many of the people with MS are being treated with immune suppressive drugs. And just looking at the global picture here, you could see that there were many different registries, some like the Swedish registry up here at the top, which is a purely clinical EHR-based registry, to in the United States, you can see both iConquerMS and something called RWD, which was a specially designed clinic-based registry. And I'd just like to say that this initiative, which was definitely a collaboration on speed, has already generated results that is advising or providing information back to physicians and MS patients. Next slide, please. In the future, we're going to be asking a very important question in the COVID-19 research area, is that, and you can see the question there, and it's basically considering my age, sex, and my particular subtype of MS and my particular treatment, which vaccine will be best for me? Or maybe turning the question around, will a vaccine be effective for someone like me? Next slide, please. And something that Vanessa mentioned as well, which is what we refer to as participant-driven research. And I give 3 examples here of different types of research. 2 of them we're quite familiar with, investigator-initiated and people-powered. But we are just about to launch with PCORI support a true, authentic, participant-driven research comprehensive system. And I think this is a very exciting development for the community as well. So I hope that, next slide, please. So I hope that I've given you some view of a single registry that is both a people and a data registry that is contributing to many different areas of MS research. Thank you very much, and thanking the iConquerMS project team, the governance, and all of the MS conquerors that are part of the iConquerMS network. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Robert and Vanessa. We've had a couple of questions come in, so I will launch right into the Q&A. The first one is about getting started as a patient group. If you're a patient group that doesn't yet have a registry and you're not sure where to start, what suggestions do you have for them? And then combined in questions, could you please also speak a little bit about availability of vendors to help out with this?
So I'd be happy to just mention that there is a collaborator, a partner that we use, an organization, company called Ordinal Data. And Ordinal Data has created the platform for a number of patient registries. Beyond that, there are many resources that one can tap into by contacting PCORI, for example, because PCORI was involved in supporting the creation of about 20 of these people-powered research network registries.
Yeah, and I'll just maybe add a little bit to that. I totally agree with the points that Robert made, but I also think some of the resources that I shared, the AHRQ guide, is really, really helpful. That's a pretty comprehensive walkthrough of lots of considerations as you're thinking of setting up a study. They also do call out different case studies of different platforms or use cases of different platforms. So that can be informative as well. And then I know that the NIH radar team, they're quite accessible and always available to offer guidance as well. And then there are a number of vendors and platforms out there that are supporting patient registries, not only in the rare disease space, but beyond for common conditions as well. So I'm happy to chat further about the platform that we offer, but there are certainly lots out there as well.
Great, thank you. And then, well, as a follow-up, we've posted links to all of the resources that Vanessa had in her presentation on the same page that everybody registered for the webinar. So feel free to go on there if you're interested in taking a look at those documents as well. But lots and lots of different vendors, different platforms. So feel free to reach out to folks for questions or ideas. One other question is about if you could comment on what a potential participant or patient can expect, whether in terms of direct or indirect benefits of participating and contributing to a patient registry.
Well, I'll have a go again, and I note that that question came from Vinit. So hi, Vinit. So there are many different. So this is one of the things that we are doing in terms of finding out what our network members want out of a network. So some of them simply want to be engaged in something and contribute. Others want to actually get involved in governance. But one of the things that I think the participant-driven research, I think, is very attractive to network members. In other words, to propose their research questions, maybe not in a fully formed research way, but to have that, as we will be probably within the month, out there for people to see and maybe vote on, and begin to push forward research that matters most to the community or to subgroups of the community. The other thing that we are doing right now and hope to launch soon is what we refer to the data give back project. So I think that there's a great deal of interest in patient reported outcomes coming into more fully to the clinical care setting. And we hope to play a role in that and serve the needs of our patients in that way as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more quick point. I think, you know, a lot of the communities that we work with are quite small. And so even just, you know, becoming part of a community and knowing that there are others that you can connect with and that you're participating in this joint effort to move research and science forward for your condition, I think has been a motivator. And then certainly that dissemination of information back to the community. So, you know, reporting back on milestones or, you know, trends that are coming from the data, engagement with the patient registry, you know, even being able to sort of see some data visualization and how, you know, you compare to others in the community, things like that, I think are quite motivating for participants as well. But I really like Robert's point about asking, you know, asking people what would be valuable and motivating to them. I think that's a great point.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa and Robert. We're just at time now. We really appreciate you participating and your presentations. And I know there's a couple more questions that we haven't been able to get to, but feel free to reach out to this email address, actually, if you want to be directed for additional resources. But we did want to do a quick reminder and plug for our next webinar in this series. It's next Friday, and it will be on the current landscape of patient-generated data and data privacy. And that will be featuring Craig Lipset and Corey Dennis, who are both experts on data privacy as well as patient-generated data. So that should also be a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next Friday for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I see there are a lot of additional questions, and I hope that the National Health Councils can coordinate them, and where possible, we will provide some answers that maybe can be channeled.
Sounds good. We'll follow up with everyone. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining and for the engaging questions, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.